OC World is made possible by the generous contributions of the Marisla Foundation, the Keith and Judy Swain Family Foundation, and viewers like you. Thank you. Welcome to OC World. I'm your host, June Kim Lopez. In this Part 2 exclusive interview with the world-renowned legal scholar Erwin Chemerinsky, we continue our conversation about the critical issues that are rocking our society today. As the Dean of UC Berkeley Law and founding Dean of UC Irvine School of Law, as well as a highly respected author and authority on the U.S. Constitution, he offers his perspectives and feelings about what's happening and what may happen. We'll recap his examination of the recent Supreme Court rulings with a focus on the path forward and look at what's ahead in future deliberations. As the Supreme Court takes its break and prepares to deliberate again in October, while the nation continues to be fueled with heated debates and uncertainty, we'll ask Chemerinsky to share with us his predictions. After all, much of what he has anticipated years ago have come true. So who better than him to give us an idea of what to expect in the next wave of decisions from the highest court in the land next year? Thank you for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in our Part 1, we talked about the U.S. Constitution and the idea of reading it as an original versus a living document and all the repercussions associated with that and how it has affected the recent rulings. We talked about the Supreme Court and Supreme Court justices and their own ideology, despite the argument that they're supposed to be value neutral. And we got into the weeds of the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade. We talked about the gun control that happened in New York. So just getting right into it, let's talk about some of these other rulings. And let's start with some criminal justice element, the Miranda rights. And as a former police officer, I'm very familiar with Miranda rights and the reason for its origin and its protection. But recently, the Supreme Court again had a different ruling on that. So can you tell us a little bit about that and why?
As you know so well, whenever somebody is in police custody, before they can be questioned, they have to be given Miranda warnings. And everyone who watched police dramas on TV or the movies knows those warnings by heart. Well, the case involved a situation where a deputy sheriff in Los Angeles County, Carlos Vega, was interrogating a man in a very small room, Terrence Tico. The interrogation was in a very intimidating way. At one point, Tico appeared to make an incriminating statement. He was criminally prosecuted. He was acquitted. He then sued the officer Vega and said, "You didn't give me my Miranda warnings. You violated my constitutional rights. You should have to pay me money damages." But the Supreme Court 6-3 ruled in favor of the deputy sheriff and against Terrence Tico. Justice Alito wrote for the court and said, Miranda is not actually a constitutional right, so there can't be a civil suit for money damages when police violate it.
And in your book, again, recently published a few years ago, Presumed Guilty, again, you saw some of these decisions on the horizon. You were quite concerned about it. What back then made you somewhat see this coming?
The pattern from the Supreme Court, especially in recent decades, is consistently to favor the police and to rule against criminal suspects and criminal defendants. And we can see this in so many ways. The way the court has opened the door to racial profiling, the way the court has failed to create limits when there's eyewitness identification procedures that lead to the conviction of innocent people, and the failure of the court to be willing to enforce Miranda.
You know, in 2020, as we were all just whirling with COVID, everything that we had to endure, then we had the Black Lives Matter. It's a very tense society in many different ways. And rulings like this just adds more fuel, regardless of what your opinion is, whether you agree or disagree. It further seems to polarize. And when these justices in Supreme Court make these decisions, do they take that into account?
I don't think the current conservative majority takes that into account at all. Our society is more deeply politically polarized at any point than it's been since the Civil War and Reconstruction. And what we have now is 5 or 6 conservative justices who have come down emphatically on the right side of the political spectrum. I'm not sure what it's going to mean for our society when it's so divided to have a court that's come down on one side of that divide.
So does that mean now, starting tomorrow, there is no requirement for police officer to give people their Miranda warnings?
Police still have to give the Miranda warnings for questioning somebody in custody. And if they don't, then any statements that are gained have to be excluded from coming in as evidence. But if the police don't do that, they can't be sued for money damages. And I worry also that the Supreme Court saying Miranda is not really a constitutional right may be paving the way to overruling Miranda in the not too distant future.
But somewhat these sort of protection, whether it's law enforcement or even public officials. You talked about how from a civil case that they are protected. So how different is this from what's been in place?
Up until now, I would have assumed if police violate Miranda, they can be civilly sued. Now, they have a defense when they're sued, and you alluded to that, and it's called qualified immunity. It says that a government officer may be held liable only if he or she violates clearly established law that every reasonable officer should know. The Supreme Court has used this to provide a great deal of protection to police officers, especially in excessive force cases.
And is this because, I guess, the political platforms of the conservative, because as you mentioned, the Supreme Court has been mostly conservative in its history. So what's different now is the question, right? We've had majority conservative justices, but why this wave of these kinds of ruling?
These justices are more conservative than any we've had, at least since the 1930s. Those who are politically conservative will be jubilant over it. Those who are liberal will lament it, but I think everyone would agree. Here's an example of this. In 1992, in a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the Supreme Court 5-4 reaffirmed Roe versus Wade. All 5 justices in the majority have been appointed by Republican presidents, and yet they voted to reaffirm abortion rights. The conservatives who are in the majority in overruling abortion, Justice Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett, are just much further to the right. And that's why I say to you, what's it going to mean to have a court that's so far to the right when our society is so politically polarized?
Now, we recently had a change in the Supreme Court. We have a new justice, Justice Jackson. Do you think that will cause a different kind of a shift or not so much?
In the short term, no. In the long term, maybe. This term, when it was Justice Breyer, it was 6-3 over and over again. There were 60 Supreme Court decisions this term. 19 were 6-3 decisions, and 9 more were 5-4. So it was 6 conservatives, all appointed by Republican presidents, and 3 liberals appointed by Democratic presidents, Justices Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson has replaced Justice Breyer. It stays a 6-3 court. Now, I have no doubt that Justice Jackson is going to make some difference. I think as the first Black woman onto the court, her experiences might in some cases persuade other justices. When it comes to the ideologically divided issues, abortion, gun rights, separation of church and state, the court's going to continue to be 6-3. But Justice Jackson is 51 years old. She could be on the court for decades. Justice John Paul Stevens didn't retire until he was 90. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg left the court when she died when she was 87. So I don't think the question is, will Justice Jackson make a difference in 2023 or even 2030? But what difference might she make in 2040 or 2050? There's no way to know because it depends on when are the future vacancies and who's president to appoint the replacements.
That is so interesting to me, just the timing and how long things will take either way, just the whole system itself. Now, you mentioned the separation of church and state, so let's get into that. Another recent ruling about prayers in school, it was the case, and that again went towards not having a wall between church and state. So talk a little bit about that ruling for us and again, what that means going forward.
It involves a high school football coach in Bremerton, Washington. He's a self-described devout Christian. He would go onto the 50-yard line after games and kneel and pray. Soon, players on his and the other team would join him. When he was asked to stop doing it, he began engaging in inspirational Christian messages, including prayer, and players from his team, the other team, those in the stands would join him. The school suspended him, and he sued, saying, "This violates my free exercise of religion and my free speech." And he won in the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision. Justice Gorsuch wrote for the conservatives. And Justice Gorsuch said it violated his free exercise of religion and his free speech to punish him for this. Of course, any restriction on prayer in schools is limiting somebody's free exercise of religion and freedom of speech. Since 1960s, the Supreme Court has consistently said that prayer in public schools, even voluntary prayer, is not allowed. In 2000, there was a case that said there can't be student-delivered prayers at high school football games. Now the court has opened the door to prayer in schools, at the very least, before school begins, recess, when children have their heads on their desks, at lunch, after school. Teachers can engage in prayer in the classrooms, and it's fine for students to join them.
So if a teacher, regardless of their religion, could have prayers of any religion, presumably. Now, it's interesting because I heard someone say, our Pledge of Allegiance says I'm one nation under God. So why is it so bad to have prayers in school? Despite whatever the religion may be, what's the harm?
I think there's a big difference between reciting one nation under God and saying the teacher is going to engage in, say, Christian prayers. What the Supreme Court said in the early 1960s, that's exactly right, is that the school environment is inherently coercive. Students will feel the pressure to participate, even if it goes against their religious beliefs. Take this example. There was a parent who complained about the football coach leading the players in Christian prayers. The parent said, "My family are atheists, and my son feels the need to participate in the prayers because he feels otherwise he's not going to get as much playing time." The idea of the Constitution should be that our government is secular. The place for religion is in our daily lives, our churches, our synagogues, our mosques. It was Thomas Jefferson, not a liberal law professor, who said that there should be a wall that separates church and state. Unfortunately, the conservatives in the court don't believe that. They've obliterated any notion of a wall that separates church and state.
We'll take it one step further now. Public funding can now go to parochial schools. And that's a new thing as well, isn't it?
In fact, the Supreme Court has gone even further than that and said the government is constitutionally required to give money to religious schools if it's giving money to private secular schools. For decades, the issue was, when may the government give assistance to religious schools? There were cases about, can the government give audiovisual equipment? Can the government provide sign language interpreter? But does that violate the Establishment Clause? Now the court has said, whenever the government gives aid to private secular schools, it is constitutionally required to give that aid to religious schools.
So as a taxpayer, which we all are, we don't get to decide where that money goes.
And we have no basis for objecting, the Supreme Court says. There was a case this term, a case called Carson versus Macon out of the state of Maine. And it involved, there are parts of Maine that are too rural to support public school systems. So the state would give money to parents to send their children to private school. And it had to be a secular school. Maine said, our goal is to provide a free, secular education for all children in the state. The Supreme Court, 6-3, declared that unconstitutional and said, the government gives money to private, secular schools. It must give it to religious schools. And this isn't just going to be about schools. As an example, many state and local governments have programs to give money for historic preservation of buildings. And historically, they wouldn't give it for churches, synagogues, mosques. I think now they're required to. Many governments have had programs for drug and alcohol rehabilitation, but said they won't fund faith-based programs where people are encouraged to get off drugs based on religious beliefs. Now I think the government is going to be required to fund those programs. So the practical significance of this is enormous. And to go to what you say, we as taxpayers can't object our money being used even to teach religious beliefs that are abhorrent to us.
Now, as the dean of UC Berkeley, I'm sure these waves of ruling have caused quite a bit of conversation and dialogue on the campus. Let's talk a little bit about freedom of speech, because you've written a book about speech on campus, and especially when we're seeing this increase in hate crimes. Help us understand the importance of freedom of speech in this context, because it can be very inflammatory, very discriminatory, very hateful. How do we justify that?
I wrote this book, Free Speech on Campus, with UC Irvine Chancellor Howard Gilman. And the central premise of the book is that all ideas and views can be expressed on campus. Now, that doesn't mean free speech is absolute. There's no right to engage in threats. There's no right to engage in harassment. There's no right to engage in inciting illegal activity. But the Supreme Court has also made it clear that hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. My view as a dean is I want my law school to be a place where all ideas, all views can be expressed. I want there to be robust debate. I want there to be liberal viewpoints, conservative viewpoints expressed. But no one can use their right to speak to silence others and shout people down.
So then what's the difference between hateful words? Because one could argue that they do shut people down. That's what you got: hate crimes that are actual violent crimes, they're crimes. Then you have hate incidents, which are these slurs, and whether it's written or conversed, they still shut you down. How do you bifurcate that?
The Supreme Court has drawn that distinction, has done so for decades. There is no constitutional right ever to engage in violence. The state can impose greater penalties for hate motive ends. When it comes to words and ideas, they can be expressed even when they're hateful. I think some of it is the impossibility of trying to define what's hate speech. Some of it is the experience in places that have tried to prohibit hate speech. They find almost always it's used against the very groups it's meant to protect. But above all, what the Supreme Court has said is it's an idea and a view, an offensive one. But if that's all it is the expression of an idea or view, the First Amendment protects it.
Well, and you not only speak of it, but you are on the receiving end, because on the first episode, you talked about these hate mails and emails. I can only imagine, especially at a time like this. How do you process that as a human being? I mean, let's put the scholar aside for a second, but let's talk just Erwin.
I've been doing this for a long time. I've been writing op-eds and appearing on programs for a long time. And that then means that people who disagree aren't always going to do so in a civil or polite way. And I get, including literally today, hateful messages. I delete them. The only thing that I think has changed that I find very disconcerting is in the last few years, I've gotten many more that are explicitly anti-Semitic. As I say, having been writing op-eds for 35 years, I'm used to getting messages that are angry, offensive, hateful. But I haven't had as many ever before as I've seen now that mention my religion.
So what's happening to our society? Because again, you've got fanaticism on both sides. A lot of people in the middle who are just trying to make sense of this. And depending on who you listen to and when you're listening to them, I mean, they can be quite convincing. How do we get to a place where it almost seems normal to be so antagonistic and just disregard sometimes in our expression of humanity? Have we not progressed? Where are we today, in your opinion?
I apologize to sound a bit political, but I think that Donald Trump has turned over a rock in our society. And he's legitimized being uncivil and at times even hateful. And I think as a result, you see much more expression of anti-Black, anti-Latino, anti-Asian, anti-Jewish sentiment. I think that we have seen a decrease in civil discourse, and I hope that we'll reverse that. I think that we should all decide that what we share in common is much more important than what divides us, and that we can engage in a discussion about how to best achieve our common goals.
So in your opinion, because you mentioned President Trump, can one person have that kind of an effect in our country today?
I think he has had that effect. I think he has changed the nature of discourse and dialogue. when you look at the things that he has said about people, really offensive, hateful things, I think people have taken that and followed the example.
I'm going to ask you to do something, which is let's play devil's advocate. Let's put your side on the other side, on the right side. Because in order to know both sides, you've studied both and you've been respected, regardless of people's political views. So if you were a conservative, a ultra conservative, let's say, someone who would be sort of rejoicing in these recent court rulings, what would you say to yourself?
If I were conservative, I would applaud who Donald Trump put on the Supreme Court. I'd say that's why I voted for Donald Trump, exactly to have justices like Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. But I would hope that even if I was conservative, I would find what he's done in terms of political discourse, what he's done in terms of denying the election results, what he's done in trying to undermine democracy offensive.
So he is no longer in the office. And as we look at the current administration, if one person in that role could change so much, we have a different person now. So why aren't we seeing a change?
I think it's a great question. I think the issue is once discourse, once the nature of discussion in society has changed, how do we go back? That when you think about just how discussion and discourse have changed in the last 5-6 years, can we go back to something that's more civil? Can we go back to something where both the left and the right can respect each other? And let me be clear, there is plenty of intolerance on both the left and the right. There are plenty of people on both the left and the right who I would condemn for their dialogue and discussion. But I think Donald Trump bears particular responsibility for how he changed the nature of discussion in this country.
The Supreme Court is on vacation right now, but they're going to come back in October, a couple months, as we're all living with this flurry of feelings. What are some of the rulings that are on the docket that cause you particular concern, that keep you awake at night?
The Supreme Court in October will have 2 cases as to whether college universities can continue to engage in affirmative action. For decades, since 1978, the Supreme Court has said that college universities can use race as one factor in admissions decisions to benefit minorities and enhance diversity. I expect the Supreme Court will overrule those decisions and say that affirmative action is unconstitutional. There's a case on the docket about whether or not a business owner, based on her religious beliefs, could discriminate against gays and lesbians. She designs websites for weddings and refuses to design them for same-sex couples. And I think the Supreme Court's going to say that people, based on their religious beliefs, can violate anti-discrimination laws. There's a case coming out of North Carolina as to whether or not the state courts can enforce the state constitution to protect the right to vote. The conservatives are arguing only the state legislature gets to do it. They get the final word, even if they're violating the state constitution. That idea, called the independent state legislature theory, is very frightening to me.
So let me guess, you're predicting, or at least maybe anticipating, that all these rulings are going to go contrary to your progressive vision.
I think the court's certainly going to eliminate affirmative action. And the court is going to say that people have the right to discriminate on account of their religion against gays and lesbians. I'm less sure what the court's going to do with the so-called independent state legislature theory, but I know 4 justices want to go in this direction, which would then mean that if a state legislature decides the electors of the state go to the loser, it's its choice. It can do whatever it wants, unconstrained by the courts and the Constitution. I fear there's 5 votes for it.
When you talk to your student body, I'm sure they come to you for advice, for reflection, for some to make sense of what's going on. What do you tell them? What's your advice?
I've thought a lot about this. While my conservative students are thrilled at what's going on, my liberal students are more discouraged than I've ever seen them. And I've been a law professor for 42 years. What I try to tell them is, quoting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. That the sweep of American history, even world history, is tremendous advances in equality and freedom. This is a regressive time, but ultimately I believe their positions will triumph, but only if they work hard to make it happen. It's not going to happen by itself.
At the end of your book, We the People, you say that we have, from a progressive perspective, that you have to fight harder and smarter. What do you mean by smarter?
Conservatives were very effective in a half-century strategy to take the courts and overrule Roe versus Wade. Liberals now need to do the same thing. So we need to look for ways to use state courts and state constitutions to advance rights when we can't use the US Constitution. We need to look for ways to mobilize people to use the political process. We need to look for ways, when we're arguing in a conservative court, to use conservative doctrines and ideology to lead to liberal results.
Well, thank you so much, Erwin. Really appreciate you sitting down with us for this really insightful, interesting two-part series. And I know there's so much more ahead, and we certainly welcome you back with more analysis, predictions, and thoughts. It means so much to us. Thank you for all your work and all your passion. Certainly, we really, truly appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us. We covered a lot in these two-part series, and we didn't even get to all of it. But I think the takeaway here is we are living in a changing times. And regardless of whether you are a Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, it's always best to understand and be informed about what's happening around us before we react with emotions. The learning is sometimes arduous and sometimes difficult and challenging. And we're so fortunate to have people like Erwin to help us navigate through these uncertain charts of our society. But hopefully, through our continued conversation and with input from you, we can continue to help you, our viewers, understand these issues and help us find a place where we can still be hopeful, regardless of how you might feel about any of these issues. So we thank you again for tuning in, and join us next time when we have more insightful coverage of critical issues that matter to you. Until then, stay safe and be well.